December 30th, 1944. The Trianon Palace Hotel, Versailles, France. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, is staring at a blank sheet of paper. His face is grey. The famous infectious grin, the one the newsreels love, the one that sells war bonds, is gone. In its place is a mask of exhaustion. His blood pressure is dangerously high. He is smoking his fourth pack of Camels for the day. Outside the frosted windows, the continent of Europe is frozen solid. It is the coldest winter in 40 years. Inside the room, the temperature is boiling. On the desk sits a cable from Washington. It is from General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. The message is coded, confidential and clear. It says, in effect, "You are the boss. If you have to fire him, the President and the American people will back you." Eisenhower picks up his pen. His hand does not shake. He begins to draft a letter to the combined Chiefs of Staff. This is not a battle plan. It is not an order for fuel or ammunition. It is a death warrant for the career of the most famous British soldier in history. The letter outlines a situation that has become impossible. It states that the differences between the Supreme Commander and Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery are irreconcilable. It demands a choice, him or me. If this letter leaves this room, the alliance breaks. If this letter is sent, Churchill's government teeters. The unity of the Western Front collapses, while the German army is still very much alive and killing American boys less than 200 miles away. Eisenhower finishes the draft. He calls for his Chief of Staff, Bedell Smith. The room is silent. The only sound is the scratching of a match lighting another cigarette. This is the moment the history books gloss over. They tell you about the band of brothers. They tell you about the tanks and the paratroopers, but they rarely tell you about the day the Allies almost lost the war, not on the battlefield, but in an office in France, destroyed by the colossal weight of one man's ego. This is the story of the order Eisenhower hid from Churchill. To understand why a man like Eisenhower, a man whose entire genius lay in compromise and diplomacy, was ready to pull the trigger, we have to go back. We have to strip away the victory culture nostalgia and look at the gritty, ugly reality of December 1944. The war was not going well. In the summer, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. It had been a sprint. Paris was liberated. Brussels fell. The Americans and British were drunk on speed, racing toward the German border. The papers said the boys would be home by Christmas, but physics caught up with them. An army is a beast that eats gasoline. General George Patton's Third Army alone was consuming 350,000 gallons of fuel a day. By late autumn, the supply lines had snapped. The Red Ball Express, that famous convoy of trucks driven mostly by African-American soldiers, was burning more fuel delivering the gas than the gas they were actually delivering. The sprint halted. The rains came. The mud of autumn turned into the ice of winter. The Allied armies hit the West Wall, the German fortifications at the border, and stopped dead. Stalemate breeds resentment. And in the Allied High Command, resentment had a name, Bernard Law Montgomery. You have to understand the difference between these two men. It is the clash of the century. Eisenhower is the chairman of the board. He is a Kansas farm boy, a staff officer who had never seen combat in World War I. He is pragmatic, political, and focused on the broad front, pushing the Germans back everywhere at once, using American industrial power to grind the enemy down. He manages personalities. He soothes egos. Montgomery is the Messiah. He is the victor of El Alamein. He is an ascetic. He doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, and goes to bed at 9:30 p.m. every night, regardless of the crisis. He believes he is the only professional soldier on the continent. He views the Americans as enthusiastic amateurs, brave but tactically incompetent. Cowboys with too much money and not enough brains. Montgomery hated the broad front. He called it drifting without a rudder. He wanted a single thrust. He wanted Eisenhower to give him, and only him, all the fuel, all the ammo, and all the reserves. He wanted to lead a narrow 40-mile-wide spearhead straight to Berlin, leaving the American armies of Patton and Bradley to sit on the sidelines and rot. For months, Monty had been nagging Eisenhower, lecturing him, insulting him in front of subordinates. He treated the Supreme Commander like a slow-witted cadet. Eisenhower took it. He took it because he had orders from Roosevelt and Churchill to keep the family together. He swallowed his pride. He smiled that famous smile. But on December 16th, 1944, the smiling stopped. The Germans launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Hitler stripped the Eastern Front. He gathered his last panzer reserves. He threw 200,000 men and 1,000 tanks at the weakest point in the Allied line, the Ardennes Forest, the Ghost Front. The Americans there were green troops or exhausted units sent to rest. They were hit with a sledgehammer. The weather was atrocious. Fog grounded the Allied Air Force. The panzers tore a hole in the American lines 50 miles wide and 40 miles deep. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Chaos reigned. Communications were cut. Regiments disappeared. Rumors flew that German commandos, commanded by Otto Skorzeny, were dressed in American MP uniforms, changing road signs and assassinating officers. Paranoia swept the headquarters. In the map room at Versailles, the situation looked catastrophic. The German drive had physically split the American forces in half. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, was headquartered in Luxembourg, south of the Bulge. But two of his huge armies, the U.S. First Army under Courtney Hodges and the U.S. Ninth Army under William Simpson, were stranded on the north side of the German breakthrough. Bradley could not communicate with them. The telephone lines were cut. The radio waves were jammed or spotty. He had lost control of half his men. Eisenhower looked at the map. He saw the reality. He had to make a decision that would hurt his own countrymen to save the battle. On December 20th, Eisenhower ordered the command of the U.S. First and Ninth Armies, 200,000 American soldiers, to be transferred temporarily to the British 21st Army Group. He was giving them to Montgomery. Militarily, it was the right call. Monty was the only commander on the north side, with the communications infrastructure to run the battle. Psychologically, it was a disaster. General Omar Bradley was humiliated. He threatened to resign. Giving American troops to Monty was like giving your children to a neighbor who has spent the last year telling everyone you're a bad father. But Ike held firm. It's a temporary measure, he told them, just to win the battle. And to his credit, Montgomery did exactly what a professional soldier should do. He arrived at the American headquarters of the First Army with his personal liaison officers, his phantoms. He looked at the chaos. He didn't panic. Monty never panicked. He tidied up the battlefield. He shortened the lines. He organized the withdrawal from exposed positions, like St. Vith. He created a solid defensive wall on the northern shoulder of the Bulge that the Germans could not break. He stopped the bleeding. If Montgomery had stopped there, he would have ended the war as a hero to the Americans, as well as the British. If he had just done the job and kept his mouth shut. But Montgomery could not keep his mouth shut. As the battle raged through Christmas, the tide turned. The skies cleared on December 23rd. The Allied Air Force, the Jabos, came back. They bombed the German fuel columns into scrap metal. Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne from the south. The German offensive ran out of gas. The crisis was passing. The adrenaline was fading. And as the fear receded, the politics returned. Montgomery saw the victory, not as a collaborative effort, but as vindication of his single-thrust theory. He believed he had saved the Americans from their own stupidity. He believed that now, finally, Eisenhower would see the light. He decided it was time to press his advantage. On December 29th, while the bodies were still freezing in the snow around Bastogne, Montgomery sat down and wrote a letter to Eisenhower. It was a letter of breathtaking arrogance. He didn't ask for permanent command of the ground forces. He demanded it. He wrote, "I suggest that your directive should finish with this sentence. From now on, one man must have full operational control of all ground forces in the north." He was rewriting the Supreme Commander's orders. He was telling Ike to step aside. When Eisenhower received this letter at Versailles, something inside him finally snapped. The rubber band broke. He had spent 2 years mediating, 2 years covering for Monty, 2 years listening to the lectures. Ike showed the letter to his staff. He wasn't red-faced. He was cold. "He thinks he can push me around," Eisenhower said. "He thinks I'm weak because I'm nice. I'll show him." This brings us back to the draft on the desk. December 30th. Eisenhower knew that if he fired Monty, the British press would crucify him. He knew Churchill might intervene, so he prepared the ultimate ultimatum, the cable to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London. "It is him or me. I cannot work with this man. Relieve him or accept my resignation." Eisenhower knew he wouldn't be the one resigning. Marshall had already assured him of that. The cable was effectively a firing order for Montgomery. Eisenhower handed the draft to Bedell Smith. "Get it typed up." We send it tomorrow. The machinery of bureaucracy began to turn. The axe was raised, but there was one man who saw the blade coming. Major General Francis de Guingond, Freddie. Freddie de Guingond was Montgomery's chief of staff. He was the unsung hero of the British Army. If Monty was the brilliant but abrasive genius, Freddie was the diplomat who cleaned up the mess. He was charming, he was liked by the Americans, and he was the only man on earth whom Montgomery listened to. De Guingond was visiting Versailles when the crisis peaked. He saw the mood in the headquarters. It wasn't the usual grumbling, it was murderous. Bedell Smith took de Guingond aside. He showed him the draft. "It's over, Freddie," Smith said. "The boss is done. We're firing him." De Guingond felt the blood drain from his face. He knew what this meant. It meant a public scandal that would shatter Allied morale. It meant the end of Montgomery, a man de Guingond loved, despite his flaws. "Give me time," de Guingond begged. "I can't," Smith said. "Ike is set." "Give me 24 hours, de Guingond pleaded. "Let me fly to see Monty. Let me talk to him. If I can't make him see reason, then send the cable, but give me a chance." Bedell Smith went into Eisenhower's office. He came out 5 minutes later. "You have 24 hours, Smith said, "but the weather is 0-0. You'll never get there." The weather was indeed lethal. Snow, ice, fog, flying was suicide. De Guingond didn't care. He grabbed a pilot and a light plane. They took off from Paris into the teeth of the blizzard. The plane was tossed around like a leaf. They flew at treetop level, dodging church steeples, navigating by following the roads below. It was a flight of pure desperation. They landed at a tactical airfield in Belgium, the wheels skidding on the ice. De Guingond jumped into a jeep and raced to Montgomery's headquarters in Zonhoven. When he arrived, the contrast was jarring. Versailles was a funeral home. Zonhoven was a party. Montgomery was chirpy. He was moving pins on a map. He looked at de Guingond and said, "Hello, Freddie. Everything is going splendidly. I think Ike is finally coming around to my way of thinking." Montgomery was living in a fantasy world. He genuinely believed that his letter of December 29th had been helpful. He thought he was being promoted. De Guingond didn't sit down. He didn't take off his coat. "Sir," he said, his voice shaking with cold and adrenaline, "you are wrong. You are catastrophically wrong." Monty looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "I have just come from Ike," de Guingond said. "He is not promoting you, he is firing you." Monty laughed. "Ike wouldn't do that. He needs me. He doesn't need you," de Guingond snapped. "Marshall has backed him, Bradley has backed him, Patton has backed him. They are ready to fight this war without the British if they have to." "The cable is written, sir. It is on the desk." He described the scene at Versailles. He told Monty about the rage of Bedell Smith. He told him that he was alone, that the Americans were done listening. For the first time in the entire war, the mask slipped. Montgomery, the man who never showed fear, looked terrified. He looked at his chief of staff. The arrogance evaporated. "What shall I do, Freddie?" he whispered. De Guingond reached into his pocket. He had written a draft letter on the plane while bouncing through the turbulence. "You must sign this," de Guingond said. "You must send it to Ike immediately. And you must not change a single word." Montgomery took the paper. He read it. It was a letter of total surrender. "Dear Ike, I have seen Freddie and I understand you are grieved by what I wrote. I express my full devotion to you. I am your subordinate. I will do whatever you say." It was a groveling apology. It was the only way out. Montgomery picked up his pen. He didn't argue. He signed it. De Guingond didn't wait. He took the letter, ran back to the jeep, drove back to the airfield, and flew back to Versailles through the same deadly storm. He walked into Eisenhower's office and placed the letter on the desk. Eisenhower read it. He read it twice. He looked at Bedell Smith. He looked at de Guingond. The tension in the room broke. Eisenhower sighed. He took the firing order, the cable that would have changed history, and crumpled it up. "All right," Ike said. "We keep going." The crisis was averted. The secret was kept. The alliance was saved by a 24-hour mercy dash. But the story doesn't end there, because a man like Montgomery cannot keep his head bowed for long. The apology saved his job, but it bruised his ego, and a bruised ego is a dangerous thing. A week later, on January 7th, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference. The battle was largely won. The Germans were retreating. It was time for the victory lap. De Guingamp begged Monty not to do it. "Just issue a written statement," he said. "Don't talk to the press. You'll say something you regret." Monty ignored him. He gathered the world's press corps. He stood before the microphones. He wanted to set the record straight, and he proceeded to light a match and throw it into a barrel of gasoline. He described the battle, but he described it as if he were a school teacher discussing a recess brawl. He said he had found the battle area in a remarkably untidy state. He implied that the Americans had been running around like headless chickens until he, the British master, arrived to save them. He said, "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. Eventually the true picture became clear. I headed off the enemy." He barely mentioned the American soldiers at St. Veth, who had bought time with their lives. He barely mentioned the 101st Airborne at Bastogne. He made it sound as if the Battle of the Bulge had been a British victory, fought with American bodies but British brains. The reaction was nuclear. When the transcript hit the American headquarters, General Omar Bradley, the mild-mannered schoolteacher general, turned purple. He refused to speak to Montgomery. General Patton wrote in his diary, "This is the last straw. The British are the enemy." The American press exploded. The headlines screamed betrayal. The average GI in the foxhole, freezing, watching his buddies die, heard that a British general was taking credit for their sacrifice. The alliance, which had been saved in private by de Guingamp a week earlier, was now being destroyed in public by Montgomery. Eisenhower was catatonic. He had spared Monty, and this was his reward. He couldn't defend Monty anymore. The American public wanted blood. It took the intervention of the greatest statesman of the age to fix it. Winston Churchill saw the transcript. He saw the danger. He knew that the Americans were now the dominant power. He knew that Britain was bankrupt and exhausted. He couldn't afford to alienate the US. Churchill knew he had to humiliate his own general to save the relationship. On January 18th, Churchill stood up in the House of Commons in London. The room was packed. The world was listening. Churchill spoke with that growling rhythmic cadence. He didn't cover for Monty. He corrected him. He said, "The United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. The Americans have lost 60 men for every one British soldier. This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." It was a masterstroke. With one speech, Churchill lanced the boil. He gave the Americans the credit they deserved. He soothed Bradley and Patton. He signaled to Washington that Britain knew its place. Montgomery was furious, but he was silenced. He had been publicly rebuked by his own prime minister. The war went on. The Allies crossed the Rhine. They surrounded the Ruhr. They met the Russians at the Elbe. Eisenhower and Montgomery finished the war together. They stood on the victory platforms. They smiled for the photos. But the friendship, whatever there was of it, was dead. Eisenhower never fully trusted Montgomery again. In his memoirs, written years later, the anger still simmered beneath the surface. He recognized Monty's tactical skill, but he never forgot the arrogance of that winter. So, what is the lesson here? Why does this story matter to us, 80 years later? It matters because we often view history as inevitable. We think the Allies were destined to win. We think the special relationship was unbreakable, but it wasn't. It hung by a thread. It hung on the patience of Dwight Eisenhower, a man who understood that leadership is 90% character and 10% strategy. Eisenhower wasn't the best tactician in the war. He wasn't the most brilliant, but he possessed the one trait that Montgomery lacked: humility. He understood that the goal wasn't to be right. The goal was to win. He was willing to be insulted, sidelined, and lectured if it meant keeping the team together. But he also knew where the line was, and when Monty crossed it, Ike was ready to act. The burn this letter moment is a case study in the burden of command. Most of us, when insulted by a colleague, want to lash out. We want to send that angry email. We want to claim the credit. Eisenhower wrote the email. He drafted the order. He let the anger out on paper. And then, thanks to the intervention of a good mediator, he paused. He waited. He allowed the apology to come. He won the war not by destroying his rival, but by managing him. The letter that would have fired Montgomery sits in the archives today. It is a ghost, a what if. If that letter had been sent, Montgomery would have been sacked. The British public would have revolted. The trust between the armies would have shattered. The war might have dragged on into 1946. The Iron Curtain might have fallen on the Rhine, not the Elbe. History turns on small hinges. A break in the weather, a tank running out of gas, a signature on a piece of paper. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was won by the courage of the American soldier, the guys in the shivering foxholes of the Ardennes. But the war was saved by the man in the office at Versailles, the man who stared at the map, smoked his cigarette, and decided that winning the war was more important than winning the argument. He hid the order, he swallowed the pride, and he saved the world.